I want to spend some time talking about the problem Canada has with its First Nations people. Um, this has been a long-standing issue. Europeans came to Canada. Aboriginals essentially lived in North America and lived here. Europeans wanted to settle and to have security over the land that they were farming. And so agreements were reached with First Nations people that there would be land set aside for them. The Europeans would be able to farm other areas of land. But first of all, in BC, there were no treaties at all were signed. The land was just occupied and used by Europeans. And in most of the rest of Canada, treaties were established. But in fact, the land that was identified in large part was not provided to First Nations. So it's an outstanding issue. The chiefs have been talking with the federal government for years. There have been some partial agreements reached, but the progress is very, very slow. And of course, the Aboriginal population continues to grow. There is more and more intermarriage, formally or informally, with non-Aboriginals. And so the ability to determine who and who isn't First Nations is becoming more and more difficult. And if you project ahead, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, this problem is only going to get very, very much worse than it has been in the past. And so I think it's essential that we come to some kind of a resolution. Now, I think having a system where you identify people in a country by race is objectionable. I happen to live in Lesotho, which is adjacent to South Africa, about 35 years ago, when apartheid was in full swing. And really, in my view, there is no difference between what the apartheid that was there in South Africa and what we have in Canada. We like to think that we're better, that we're identifying people on the basis of race so that we can give them a hand up. We're trying to help them out. And so therefore, we're better than South Africa, where there was a racial distinction made, but it was an attempt to keep people down. But at the end of the day, I don't think it makes a bit of difference in terms of how that is implemented. In South Africa, they did some very unusual things. For instance, some families, because it was difficult to determine whether they were black or whether they were colored, so-called mixed race. Some of the things they would do is take a hair out of somebody's head, and the number of times it would wrap around a pencil would determine whether you were colored or determined to be a black person. Well, some families went one way, some went another within the same family. And we look back at that and we shake our head that that's a terrible way to run a country. But in fact, in Canada, we're doing exactly the same thing. And even though the gist of it is to help out, I think in fact the opposite occurs. And we've had all kinds of problems in the past. I won't go through all the litany of issues, but Aboriginal children were taken from their parents, put in boarding schools, and a number of them, of course, there were examples of abuse. So the history is just terrible, and I think what we need to do is make everybody Canadian, and we don't worry about their racial background whatsoever. Now, it's quite true that we haven't fulfilled the obligations. So I think and we can't give the land. It's been alienated, privately owned by various people. We can't expect now at this date to fulfill what was specified in the treaties. So I think the best way to proceed is to come up with a dollar amount that will compensate First Nations people and say, all right, now the obligation has been fulfilled, and from this point forward, we're all Canadians. Now, it gets quite complicated because some First Nations have in fact got land provided and other ones have not. So I guess there would have to be some different arrangement made with each band depending on whether or not they've already received some benefit. So it's not as simple and straightforward as it might seem at first glance. But at the end of the day, I think a resolution is required. we would have to find a way that made sure this was acceptable to the Supreme Court of Canada, whether all provinces and the federal government had to agree, and there would be a constitutional amendment to put this through. I recognize that this may be a bit complicated and has to be worked on, but I think a solution could in fact be realized. And I think if you deal with Aboriginal individuals as opposed to their chiefs, I think you'll have a better chance of getting a resolution. Because let's face it, there's no real reason why the chiefs should come to a resolution. Many of them are making $200,000 or $300,000 a year, looking after their tribe and trying to negotiate with the federal government. And if all of this was resolved, the chiefs wouldn't be able to earn their $200,000 or $300,000 a year. So I don't think you can expect the chiefs to come up with a solution to this problem, because it's not in their interest to do so. So I think you have to be dealing more directly with the membership of the band. In fact, one quick change that I think would work is, instead of the federal government transferring the money to the chiefs to run their communities, I think what they should do is identify the individuals in the tribe and send the money to the individuals and have the chief tax it back. Then the chiefs would be accountable to their membership. And I'm absolutely certain that the members would not tolerate $200,000 and $300,000 and $400,000 salaries by the chiefs, because right now they don't see that as being their money. It's the chiefs are getting $300,000 a year. It's really money that they're getting from the federal government. So we have to change that. The chiefs, I think, are part of the problem. We have to go over their head and work directly with the membership. And I think a resolution could in fact be made. And if we don't do this in the next 10 years, I think it's going to be exceedingly difficult to carry on, because, as I say, with intermarriage, it becomes more and more difficult to determine who is and who is not of Aboriginal descent, especially because of the recent court ruling that the Métis people will somehow qualify for benefits. And I think that makes it very, very difficult. In my own family, I've got my granddaughter is indirectly of Aboriginal descent. Now, it's 2, 3, 4 generations away from being First Nations, but does she qualify for some of the settlement? It just seems to me to be an ongoing problem that has to be resolved, and it's distasteful to have people in a country designated by race. I think we need to all be Canadians, and the sooner we get on with that, the better.